just showing people the power of the cerebrospinal fluid. And as more and more research comes out, more and more studies are going to show from a very scientific perspective what the cerebrospinal fluid does, where we're altering our state of consciousness. That can be through breath, it can be through body work, it can be through dance, it can be through music, it can be through drumming, it can be through psychedelics, it could be through any, I'm obviously leaving out a ton of different, but there's a sense that the physical space, the physical boundaries of our body morph. Human white blood cells responded to the water, but happened only if the solution was shaken during the dilution. This is actually published in Nature, which
Yeah.
is the one of the premier science journals.
Because you mentioned several times death. So what do you think about past lives? Hello and welcome. I'm Sarah, and today I've got an absolutely superb guest again. And this is Dr. Zapatero, who is a Harvard graduate, but he's a medical doctor, and he also did his PhD in Harvard on the cerebral spinal fluid and stem cells. Dr. Zapatero has published numerous scientific articles in a variety of journals, and he's also written some books. But another really fascinating aspect of Dr. Zapatero is his interest and knowledge in human consciousness, quantum biology, water, and more. And he offers consultations where he does regenerative medicine, working on biofields, working with movement, Reiki, and more. So his contact details are in the show notes. So it was a superb conversation with lots of really interesting topics, ranging from what's in the cerebral spinal fluid, how do we know we've got a problem there, how does water impact consciousness, and then we move into questions about consciousness existence. So I hope you enjoy our conversation. Okay, welcome, Dr. Zapatero. So you're both an MD and a PhD, and you're both spiritual and scientific. So maybe just let people know how the spiritual side got into you.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest with you, thank you very much for having me on, first of all. And what a beautiful thing to be able to talk about. It really comes just from an inquiry into who we are. That's really what it comes down to be honest with you. And ever since I was a young child, just asking, who am I? What am I? And that really kind of led to my interest in things like math and science and biology and embryology. And really, my major at UCLA was molecular cell and developmental biology. And it was a new major at the time because we were understanding more and more about genes and genetics. But if you think about that, just those three words really, really resonate with me. You're looking at the molecule, you're looking at the cell, and you're looking at development, which is a combination of how molecules work and how individual cells come together and form an organ that then can actually, grow and develop from a single-celled egg that gets fertilized by a sperm in humans, or in other vertebrates and invertebrates. And so that was just a fascination, and that was a very initially it's a very sort of physical, like how does this one cell become a human body that walks and talks and functions and everything. And yet, is that all of us? Is that only is that it? And with my mother sort of exposing me to more shiatsu acupuncture, looking at the charts of these energy channels in acupuncture, Chinese medicine, that travel through the body. It's sort of like, oh wow, what are they actually, kind of like trying to understand, like, what are they actually mapping, right? And just inquiring about that. Is it was Were they actually mapping a blood vessel, or were they mapping a nerve, or were they mapping something, were they mapping a lymphatic channel or something like, or were they mapping, and so those were just the questions that would come up in terms of in terms of kind of understanding ourselves, but also knowing that um, there was something that was present, that was outside the physical body, um, and that just really was a felt sense. And then in meeting my wife, she really helped sort of focus me on it, and say, hey, look, this is real. But again, I've mentioned this in the past. I knew when I was going out to medical school, I knew that, like, I was flying from LA to Boston, and I knew I was going to learn anatomy. I knew I was going to learn physiology. I knew I was going to learn cardiology and pulmonology and immunology from the Harvard Medical School perspective. But I also thought, hey, look, the health and healing is just much bigger than this, and we've got to incorporate other philosophies and thoughts of care, looking at Chinese medicine, looking at energy, looking at meridians, looking at Ayurvedic medicine, all that sort of stuff, and how did those philosophies come through? And so, the book that I was reading, flying from LA to Boston to start medical school, was Carolyn Mace's Anatomy of the Spirit, and just sort of talking about, what is, yes, I'm gonna learn about the anatomy. I can cut through this bone, but prior to that, right? What is it? What's the anatomy prior to that physical contact of, skin to skin? And so it was really kind of like, what are we? Who are we? How do we develop? And just sort of keeping a multitude of perspectives in mind as I'm going through this training, and really trying to kind of have a holistic approach. Could it be even wider? It probably could, but at this point, there's sort of a kind of a capacity that I can hold. Is that expanding? It is. It continues to expand with my personal inquiries, with my personal meditations, or introspective journeys, et cetera, et cetera.
Okay, so I suppose if we start off with the scientific, Dr. Zapatera, because your speciality is the cerebral spinal fluid, and some people might not have any idea what that is. And I think I remember from another podcast you were saying that it's not about what's in it, it's about the whole thing globally. Because also, for those who are interested in things more esoteric, we can talk about the memory of water in the the cerebral spinal fluid, and also it contains DMT, or which some people will know is a very powerful hallucinogen. So there's two now. There's now the CSF can be split into two groups again, and I think you've published lots of papers on it as well. So I think that will be an interesting route in now to talk about your speciality.
Yeah, so a lot of my research has been on the cerebrospinal fluid, and essentially, just bringing awareness to this fluid for people. Some people have no idea that they have fluid in the middle of their brain, bathing their whole brain. And so really it's about bringing awareness to that, and just showing people the power of the cerebrospinal fluid. And as more and more research comes out, more and more studies are going to show from a very scientific perspective what the cerebrospinal fluid does. And as we develop new technologies and new instruments of measuring, whether it's movement or energy, whatever it might be, this field is just going to explode. And so it's a matter of kind of having a relationship with the fluid, learning how to have a relationship with the fluid already, and guiding, and essentially working with it and guiding it. But I just had a meeting yesterday with somebody who had a cerebrospinal fluid leak, and he's like, I didn't even know that we had cerebrospinal fluid in our brain until all of a sudden something happened, and I wasn't feeling like myself. And his comment was, is one of the best things that's ever happened to me. It made me slow down. It made me ask questions about who I was, and I was like, wow, that's really amazing. Um, anyways, the cerebrospinal fluid is a clear fluid that is in the middle of your brain. It's housed in these cavities in the middle of your brain called ventricles, and it bathes the outside of your brain. It goes all the way down your central canal. There's a hole in the middle of your spinal cord, and that hole is filled with cerebrospinal fluid. The outside of the spine is bathed in cerebrospinal fluid, and the cerebrospinal fluid goes all the way down to the sacrum. There's sort of a fluid repository down by the sacrum, and so it's a fluid that our central nervous system is completely bathed and buoyant in. And so if you can imagine like the weight of our, if I took a brain and like weighed it, it could be anywhere between 1,500, maybe 1,200 to 1,500 grams. Um, if I took it out of the fluid and sort of put it on a scale with the cerebrospinal fluid, that comes down to about 25 to 50 grams. So this weight, 1.5 kilograms of weight that's up here is actually only 25 grams, which is quite, so that's what the cerebrospinal. So imagine, right, that your brain and spinal cord, like a ball and a rope, is totally suspended, right, in the middle of our bodies. He's totally suspended in this fluid, just like you would imagine a buoy on the ocean. Okay. And when, initially we just thought that was the function of the cerebrospinal fluid, is essentially, bong, I hit my head, and it provides that buffer. It provides a fluid buffer to, brain injuries and things like that. And what research over the last 20 years has shown is that it's much more complex and beautiful than that. Yes, it does definitely provide a buffer. It definitely provides a buoyancy to the brain, for sure. It definitely provides sort of an initial kind of shock absorption. But what we've learned through a number of my studies and other studies that came out is that it's absolutely essential for development, for brain development, for growth. It's absolutely essential, and it provides growth factors to the developing brain. It provides nutrients. The cerebrospinal fluid is changing. The contents of the cerebrospinal fluid as a whole is changing from day to day in embryologic development. It's more stable in the adult, but there's still a lot of changes that occur in it, especially fluctuations in things like melatonin. You mentioned DMT. Melatonin increases dramatically in the cerebrospinal fluid at night when lights go down. Melatonin concentrations increase dramatically, and then decrease around 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning when the natural light comes up. And so there's lots of different fluctuations in the cerebrospinal fluid, even in the adult, but it's such neurologic development. It helps guide new neurons in terms of where to go. And what we showed specifically is that the cerebrospinal fluid actually provides what we call a stem cell niche. And so stem cells are these pluripotent or totipotent cells. Stem cells are cells that can become a variety of other cells. If they're totipotent, that means total potential, they can become every cell. If they're pluripotent, that means that they can become some cells, that they differentiated to some degree, and they can become some cells, not all cells. And so what we found is that the cerebrospinal fluid actually provides information, right? So when I'm talking about the fluid providing information, that information can come from a biological molecule right? A hormone, a growth factor, electrolytes, whatever that might be. That information might come from um, uh, vibrations. That information might come from light. That information might come from anything that can be transmitted through this fluid. So let's just go back to the pure science, right? What we know, what people say, oh, well, how do you know what molecules are transmitted? Well, what we did is we actually, we took stem cells, neural stem cells, and we just cultured them in cerebrospinal fluid. And what we found is that the cerebrospinal fluid itself could maintain this stem cell niche. It could maintain the cell as a stem cell. That it didn't, usually what happens when you remove a stem cell from its environment, it differentiates. It becomes a neuron, it becomes a glial cell, it becomes an astrocyte or something like that. And so what we found is actually, when we bathed it and when we kept supplying cerebrospinal fluid, that it maintained itself as a stem cell. So we showed essentially that the cerebrospinal fluid helped maintain this stem cell niche. And just like what you mentioned, there's a sort of a reductionist approach in science of trying to figure out, oh, what's the one molecule that's doing that, right? And I was always arguing. I was like, guys, it's not the one molecule. It's the fluid. It's what's in the fluid, right? It's all of it. We can't separate one molecule from. But based on, sort of like, oh, okay, I need to get my PhD. I need to show this one molecule, right? What the postdoc and I worked on in the lab was essentially trying to show, the one molecule that not only changed dramatically, but when we added more of that, we could get more of this stem cellness or proliferation. When we took it away, we decreased that, and so we're kind of going down that path almost as a need basis. And so just then, right, sort of like, oh, wow, it provides a stem cell niche. In us, in the adult brain, a lot of our stem cells, we still have stem cells in the adult brain. A lot of our stem cells are actually making contact with the cerebrospinal fluid right now. And if you imagine whether or not you want to take it to whatever level, and I think that's kind of the cool part of this fluid is you could be on the purely biological level, just like what you mentioned, right? And say, hey, look, the CSF has got X, Y, Z, A, B, C. It's got over 100 compounds in it. And they change. And just like melatonin changes, right? So if the fluid can provide some sort of instruction or information to the brain, whether that's through melatonin, whether that's through a secreted growth factor, whether that's through hormones, whether that's through neurotransmitters that have been released into the CSF, like DMT, whatever it might be, that there's a mode of information that the CSF can carry to the brain. Okay, and you just have to kind of think anatomically, right? If I'm a stem cell, why would I want a little appendage that's monitoring the fluid? Right, sort of like, oh, that's an interesting, just a purely anatomic question, right? Why? Well, there's something then. So then my hypothesis is, well, there's something in the fluid that is providing information to the stem cell to direct it on what to do, right? Because otherwise it wouldn't need that little connection. Sort of like, well, I'm just going to pull this little connection and I already know what to do. Well, no, that's not actually true. It's getting some sort of information from the fluid to know what to do. Do I replicate myself and make another cell and stay as a stem cell? Or is there some sort of signal that states, oh, I need to go over here based on how the fluid is moving, or based on the resonance or vibrations in the fluid, or based on this compound that has been now secreted into the fluid? I actually need to go and differentiate and become a neuron and migrate over here to this part of the brain. And so if you look at it as just a fluid that's bathing the inside of your brain, that's bathing the outside of your brain, that's providing this buoyancy, but that is able to transmit information, whatever that classification of information you want it to be, that's it, right? And so now we've established that fact, is that this is a fluid that can transmit information. That information is a biological molecule, growth factor, hormone. Now, right, we've got to ask the question, well, there have been studies that have shown, for instance, um, that um, that based on the actual flow of the cerebrospinal fluid inside the ventricles, that can actually direct where the neural stem cells, where the new neurons are actually going. So now we say, wow. So not only does the fluid, from a very scientific perspective, provide information from a biological molecule, but it also provides information based on flow and movement that is very well studied. And that flow and movement can actually provide a signal to the brain to instruct it on what to do. That's pretty cool, right? That's been shown. Okay, there's other studies that have been shown, for instance, that on the wall of the ventricles that there's photoreceptors. So photoreceptors can perceive light. Okay, so then changes in light. Maybe there's something about the absorption of light that then the cerebrospinal fluid is able to transmit different types of light. If you're looking at light and movement, now you're looking at other types of energy, right? Whatever that other types of energy may be. And so now you're kind of getting into, wow, this seems like a really intelligent fluid, right?
Because
And so,
just with light, just so people know that red light and blue light and infrared can penetrate very deeply, but UV light from the outside doesn't. So would you agree that it's the visible light that's causing the effect from the outside? And do you think our bodies can make UV light on the inside that can communicate with the cerebral spinal fluid? Because I find this absolutely fascinating, the idea of the light show in the CSF.
yes, totally, absolutely. And, there is, so, I love the fact that you brought in infrared, because that's actually one of the, if we get into it, in terms of becoming the fourth phase of water, infrared light was actually shown to be a possible inducer of that fourth phase. And people are finding a lot of health benefits from infrared light. So yes, and there, there's a lot of research that has actually shown that when cells undergo when cells undergo DNA division, for instance, that the spark of UV light actually is emanated from the cells, sort of as an internal illumination of that division. So, everything you mentioned is all possible hypotheses of that of the internal light. So, yes, absolutely, and just kind of like, if we know that it transmits this information, well, then, the most basic question is, what else can it transmit? What else that we're not thinking about? We are, but like, what else, are we not seeing or thinking about or feeling that may actually be transmitted through this fluid? And so that's sort of an inquiry. That's it's a question. So that's where the new, I would say, that's where science hits spirituality. That's where the new line of research is coming out from, with the people who are interested in this.
Just
So
go into the spiritual side, I just wanted to ask, because you mentioned about children and CSF, and I think I've got the idea. It's like a river providing information. Can it be implicated in, say, epilepsy, that faults in the actual flow dynamics of the CSF can be causative of, say, epilepsy or mental health disorders? And then we'll jump into the spiritual side, just so people can understand when they might have a CSF problem and when to look into it further. What kind of symptoms would come up from a CSF flow issue?
There's a lot of, I think as we get into it more, we're going to start seeing more and more. So first of all, what we discovered, what the research discovered over the last 10 years is essentially that the CSF is not only housed in these ventricles, and that what happens is that primarily during sleep, there's sort of gates or channels that open up, and that the CSF can actually flow into the brain tissue itself. And so what happens in that flow from the ventricles into the brain tissue itself is it cleans out any toxins that develop. Um, and so this is known as the glymphatic system, sort of taken from the lymphatic system, which is the movement of fluid through the extracellular matrix, through the outside of the cells, let's say, of the body. This is the glymphatic system, set up by glial cells and sort of opening up these channels between the cells. You can imagine sort of a flow in between cells, and what they showed is that this actually opens up during sleep. So when we sleep, and this was sort of the first time that research has shown the importance of sleep, when we sleep, these channels open up and the cerebrospinal fluid in pulsations is able to flow through the brain tissue itself, cleaning out these toxins. Right. So that's number one. Number one is the implications of this are for neurodegenerative diseases in terms of these toxins. If the river, just like you alluded to, if this river is not flowing, the river is all the way from our sacrum, up our spine, into the ventricles, through the brain tissue, out to the outside of the brain, and then it gets absorbed, come back to the heart. And it's just sort of, you can imagine this flow. The heart
What's
pumps
the
it in.
pump, what's the pump for the CSF's flow? Do the sphenoid bones play a role, or is that not correct? Because what pushes it?
Yeah, I'm not sure about. There's definitely sphenoid bone movement and respiration and even in movements. The things that have been looked at in terms of strong movement of the CSF. First of all, there's constant production of the CSF by the choroid plexus. So imagine you have this source of CSF that's constantly coming in. You also have a resorption mechanism. So that's one. If you have a source of fluid and then you have a pulling away of the
Oh,
fluid,
like a
you're just going to
sponge. So something makes
exactly,
it and the sponge
exactly.
makes it. Okay, I get it. That's a
And
really
that goes back into the
interesting.
veins, and then the veins take it to the heart, and the heart can pump it back to the liver, and then we either pee it out or get rid of any toxins that get back into the bloodstream. So it's sort of like, here's the source, it pumps it in, and then here's the little sink, and it flows out. So that's one way. What we've what another way that it moves is our heartbeat. The heartbeat, every single time we have a heartbeat, for instance, that helps move the cerebrospinal fluid. A really powerful movement of the cerebrospinal fluid that has been shown is actually our breath as well. And this ties in then breath work to the movement of the cerebrospinal fluid, to these resonant sort of pulsations that can occur in the cerebrospinal fluid, activating the pineal gland in the third ventricle, possibly releasing DMT, having it go into the CSF, and now you're using the pulsation of the fluid through the breath to really get this flow moving. They've shown that like directed ultrasound, they've recently shown strobe, a checkered board of strobe lights, for instance. So stimulating the occipital lobe, the visual cortex can do it. So a lot of things are actually coming out that can actually stimulate this flow.
Is it
The
true that sleeping on a slope can help detox your brain at night, or is that just people inventing beds on slopes to sell money? Sorry, to sell products.
I haven't seen that. I do know that there are certain positions that have been implicated, but it wasn't a slope. It was mostly, and I can't remember off the top of my head. It was some sort of lateral, some sort of fetal or lateral position, and a lot of kind of what I come back to is once you have a relationship with the fluid, then you can test it yourself, right? Put yourself in an incline and see does that help. It's never helped me. In fact, I actually like being very flat. I sleep on my side beautifully. I get into a fetal position and I just curl up and sleep on my side. I feel like there's a connection back into the womb when I do that, and so that's just me. And so does just because I feel comfortable allow the flow to occur? I don't know, but try it for yourself, right? Put yourself on an incline before you spend so much money. Get one of those foam pads, put yourself on an incline, see how comfortable you feel. You might not feel so comfortable. So the flow is really important. Now there are some things like hydrocephalus that can occur, and there's various types of hydrocephalus. But you know, anytime you're having any sort of neurological symptoms, headaches, dizziness, gait problems, if you're having any incontinence, or you're having a hard time relieving your bowels or bladder or anything like that, checking in with a neurologist would probably be the best advice from just a purely medical perspective, because they would get a CT scan or an MRI of your brain to make sure that there's no issues in blockages, because you could have a blockage where your CSF is not actually flowing out, and so the fluid is actually now compressing on the brain tissue and affecting it. Now there have been some cases where people have had more CSF than others, and these are case reports, and they're still very functional. They have high IQs, and have even been high school athletes and things like that. So we're learning more about the cerebrospinal fluid, but in essence, any kind of neurological symptom or issue that you may have, my recommendation would be to follow up with a neurologist. Um, um, but what we're going to see is that those are probably the minority of issues. The biggest issue, I think, is going to be sort of neurodegenerative disease, cognitive decline, Alzheimer's, dementia, things like that emerge as this river's flowing and it stops flowing. As we do things like we start breathing with our mouth, maybe older in age, we start sleeping worse, and so we're not engaged in activities that help open up these channels. And so my hypothesis is that essentially there's a number of practices that can help increase the flow of the cerebrospinal fluid, including things like deep meditation, body work, cranial sacral therapy, or cranial osteopathy, even chiropractic manipulation of the neck to make sure that the flow up the spine is occurring properly.
What about
We're going to
just
start
Pilates?
seeing
What about yoga or Pilates or somatic
yoga,
or
Pilates,
uh,
movement, any movement,
Feldenkrais?
forward bends, backward bends,
Yeah.
music, sound. So imagine it as here's this lake of fluid in the middle of our system, and then how can you affect any lake? Just get into a bathtub, right? Start playing a beat right next to the water. Well, does that affect the water? Yes. Okay. Now start moving the water. Does that affect the water? Yes. Okay. So can I do this? And yes, you're affecting your cerebrospinal. Can I hum? Yes, I'm causing vibrations in my
And I
neck.
suppose gargling, I think that's alluded to the fact that being sedentary is not just bad for your frontal lobes and your joints, it's also bad for your CSF.
Exactly. So so it's sort of like, what practices are we doing to help uh, relax the nervous system, in essence, to help maybe get into a parasympathetic state, maybe even exercise the sympathetic and the parasympathetic, um, breathing exercises, meditation exercises, movement exercises, breathing with movement, whatever it might be, can all start to really kind of get this flow of the cerebrospinal fluid going.
Okay, now we've established there's a very scientific aspect to this, and you've published papers. Shall we move into the spiritual side? Because this is another area of your expertise, because I've watched your videos and I know you have this other dimension to yourself. So maybe we could start with the memory of water in the CSF and maybe Luc Montagnier's work, May Wan Ho, but also you're free to speculate, because there are people who listen that are very interested in chakras and higher selves and connection with source. So maybe we could start there and then move into the spiritual side of the CSF.
Yeah. So, you bring up many different points here. First of all, it's water. It's 99% water. And so you've got to anybody that has any sort of inquiry into the properties of water, beyond just, I can drink it and hydrate myself. But any sort of maybe of the newer research that's coming out, that is, I think is exciting, and is going to continue to develop. But even water being able to hold energy, or hold a memory, or hold some sort of, again, I, I like the word, information,
Mm.
because I'm not quite sure what that information is. Because an information, if I teach you that, for instance, that means hello, then I can just do this, and you know what hello is. And if that just becomes a universal sign, then I can just do this. So is there a universal sign, for instance, in the way that the water molecule is vibrating, that has a certain information that can be transmitted that way, right? So the resonance of the water molecule, the way that individual water molecules are actually having a relationship with each other, the resonance of the bond between the hydrogen and the oxygen, for instance, can all carry information. And so therefore, anything that you can ascribe to sort of like, oh wow, water having some sort of memory, having some sort of energetic component that can be transmitted beyond time and space, for instance, um, um, that it's held in the water molecule itself. That if the water molecule evaporates, that's still held in the evaporative steam that comes up, and that if it condenses and now becomes a cloud and comes back into the ocean, that's still held in the ocean. These are all, again, hypotheticals, but possibilities. Um, and so if you kind of ascribe, hey, what could the water do? Now just say, oh, wow, I have this water in the middle of my brain. And this CSF was physically connected to your amniotic fluid in the womb before you were even anything that resembled a, a human shape. So this goes back to the primordial fluid in your mother's womb, when you were a single sheet of cells. Physically, that fluid that's bathing the single sheet of cells is what's called the amniotic fluid.
Could you say
Our
that, there's the non-hereditary factor in genetics, and I know Rupert Sheldrake has his ideas about the morphic field. Do you think that the CSF and the amniotic fluid could be some kind of means for passing on hereditary information now that,
Absolutely.
okay.
Absolutely, because now you're looking at that fluid is then held in the mother, right? So whatever the mother's going through in those 9 months, that energy is being transmitted to the fluid. The fluid then, as you're going through development, you're a single sheet of cells. Every single one of your cells is going to come from that single sheet. That single sheet becomes three layers. Then it undergoes an invagination, and it folds back up on itself. Now we have a tube. Inside the tube, now we have cerebrospinal fluid that has started to differentiate itself from the amniotic fluid in the womb. Okay, so just energetically and physically. So physically, right, they talk about sort of a vestigial amount, a homeopathic amount. There'd be a homeopathic amount of the amniotic fluid from when you were a single layer sheet in our cerebrospinal fluid today. Okay, so can that actually transmit information of the embryo, of the womb? And then where does that fluid come from? Well, that fluid then comes from the fetus. That comes from the embryo that was, or the egg that was fertilized, right? So all the fluid in there comes from that egg and sperm that were fertilized. The fluid comes in, it self secretes, and so it's creating this fluid. So you can go back all the way from now the amniotic fluid, from the CSF going into the amniotic fluid, going actually back into the egg, going back into the ovary, going back into the mother, and that, right, that egg and ovary we're actually present physically in your grandmother.
I was going to say the maternal lineage, that it may not be
Exactly.
just
So
the
now you're
magic.
going that maternal lineage, right?
Yeah.
Because the egg that developed, the egg that created me was already inside my mother when my mother was a fetus
Mm,
inside my grandmother, right? That's physical. We know that for sure.
mm.
Okay. So now, right, through the fluid, if the fluid has this sort of ability to hold this information, we know that there's a homeopathic amount of amniotic fluid in the cerebrospinal fluid. Through the energetics of the fluid, can we go back not only to our single layer sheet or our amniotic fluid, sort of hang out in there a little bit, but then even our grandmother's, our mother's birth, going back through the fluids. And so now you're seeing this sort of connection, physical connection through the fluid. Okay, that's number one. And that's just purely taking it from any of the new research that's coming out, I believe, on water.
Also,
The other things is
just because you mentioned homeopathic, some people don't understand the idea of resonance, because we're talking about finite parts per million of information from grandmothers and great grandmothers. So it's in the CSF, it's the resonance of something like melatonin or DMT, isn't it? So maybe just before we move on, so people understand that homeopathy isn't actually quackery. It's a different means of understanding very, very, very dilute solutions.
very, very dilute solutions. And I was just writing this down here the other day. Let me see if I can find it. Oh yeah, okay, here it is. Look at this. I was just actually researching this.
Oh, brilliant.
Um, this
Quantum
is amazing. Yeah,
entanglement.
great question, by the way. Okay. Um, all right, so this is actually, I believe he was a French, Benveniste, published a paper about homeopathy in Nature in 1988. All right, and he was looking at homeopathy, and what they did is they took a diluted solution of antibodies in water, that there was no possibility of any antibody remaining in that water solution. So you take there were antibodies in the water, then you dilute it. You dilute the antibodies so much that there was no possibility of any antibody remaining in that water. And then what they did is they took the water and exposed human white blood cells to that water. Okay. And what they saw was that the white blood cells responded to the water as if there was a quantity of antibodies in the water. All right. And so what they said is human white blood cells responded to the water, but happened only if the solution was shaken during the dilution. This is actually published in Nature, which
Yeah.
is one of the premier science journals in the world in 1988. Okay. And so what they said in that was that there's some memory that the water is able to hold from the presence of the antibodies that were in the water, even though we diluted it so much that there was some memory that the white blood cells were able to respond to that. Okay. And I love this because I believe that the editor at the time, and this might not be like 100% correct, and I do apologize because I'm sort of remembering back. But the editor at the time, essentially, there was so much backlash about this paper that because everybody thought that it could not be possible, so there was this a priori sort of judgment. There's no way that this can be possible. But the editor actually said, we've gotten, it sort of said, we have had so much sort of like, we couldn't believe the results ourselves, but we couldn't find any error in the methodology. to not publish.
Yeah.
So it's kind of funny, right? So then, because it was like such a, I believe that they tried to like reproduce it or something like that, and it wasn't reproduced. I believe the editor or some, they sent some other scientists to this guy's lab and they tried to reproduce it and it wasn't reproduced. Um, and so then they said, okay, it's, 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 uh, it's quackery or whatever. But there's really good, so, if you're interested, go back to that Nature paper, 1988. Benveniste, I believe he was a French scientist who was studying that, published in Nature.
I'll
The
link it.
interesting
I'll
part,
find it and I'll link it into the description.
okay, yeah, I'm not, yeah,
Yeah.
um, you know, the interesting part about any scientific study is actually we actually know that like 50% of scientific studies cannot be reproduced.
I
Like if
thought it was more than that. I thought it was more like 80%.
Okay, well there you go. Okay,
Yeah.
let me be the science lover over here and say 50. You say 80, right? But even 50%, right? That's half. That's half of all the stuff that we read that's peer reviewed, that's in all these journals. Can't be reproduced. Do we not believe that? It's just sort of like, oh, well, it hasn't, well, maybe it was the setting, maybe it was the situation, maybe it was actually the intention of the scientist that was doing the experiment. Maybe all of a sudden, when it was being scrutinized and right, kind of like a
Yeah.
double slit experiments, as soon as we start observing it and paying attention, now it changes and it does something else, right? So those are all possibilities that we've actually seen happen in science. Okay, so we know how many professors have been accused of fraud. High chiefs, professor, et cetera, et cetera, been accused of fraud, data manipulation, in very high quality journals. This is happening. So just because that wasn't able to be reproduced, it's like, wow, that actually happened, right? So in sort of in kind of the way that I think about things, it's like, wow, well, unless he's lying, right? Which I can't imagine that he's lying or completely manipulated and fabricated the data. Um, if that actually happened once, then we should figure, then that possibility is present in the universe. And we should try to figure out the set and setting that works, that is actually happening in. Okay? Because if that's present, then the potential of it is there. It's just a matter of now unmasking it, right? So if the potential is there, so now, right? So now I come back to, well, if he showed that a dilution of antibodies in water where there was no antibodies actually affected white blood cell, and that potential is present in the universe, then that potential is present in the cerebrospinal fluid. Okay. So therefore, now we're looking at it as, wow, the memory of the amniotic fluid from our mother as we were in the womb could still be in the cerebrospinal fluid today. That potential is present. Now it's sort of like, oh, unearthing it, unmasking it, opening it up, right? Some people get forced onto it. Other people actually choose to kind of inquire and start to develop a relationship with it. And so, so that's homeopathy. So there's a homeopathic component of the amniotic fluid that was present in, like, bathing you as an embryo in your cerebrospinal fluid today. Okay. Now we know things like Bach flower remedies, or some of the work of Masaru Emoto, who Dr. Dean Radin has actually tried to replicate and do double-blind studies on it, and has actually published on it, and showed that maybe water does have some sort of memory, even in terms of the language that's put on the water or the intentions that are held in the water or anything like that. Dr. Dean Radin tried to reproduce that and was actually successful in doing so in more of a double blind situation. So here's this Bach flower remedies, right? Water or some sort of solution holding the energetic component of a flower. We ingest it, and that then affects our system somehow. So, just in that quality of the water being able to hold some sort of energy, some sort of memory, whatever it might be, that's kind of like the number, that's one. But there's
Wouldn't
many
that
others. One is
Wouldn't that depend on the light? Because in a lab, you've only got blue artificial light and probably EMF from the computers. Yet humans, we can be in red light, sunlight. So maybe it's a water structuring effect based on the wavelengths of light in natural light that's being
and
missed in
that's
the lab.
exactly.
Because if someone opened a window in a lab, like I've worked in a lab, and in the summer we have all the windows open, in the winter we don't. So I've changed the lighting environment of my things to make it natural. So I'm sure the light plays a role in all of these discrepancies.
It
Not lying
absolutely plays a role.
scientists.
Yes. And we're not looking at a lot of, if it didn't work, we sort of just throw it away. Oh, that doesn't happen. As opposed to looking at all the other factors, that may be present. Um, and so, yeah, so you're right on. Just looking at this, like the light, how is the light affecting the fluid? And that then even gets into, for instance, that's just does the light structure the water or the fluid in such a way that then the memory can be transmitted, or that we can perceive the memory, right? That there's an opening in our sensory component, whatever that might be, that actually perceives it. And so, remind me to get onto that. But the other one is just a pure vibration, right? So here's this water that can actually, you can create a vibration, whether it's through sound or movement, or bending forward and looking back up, here
Do you
here
think the water dances? You know, like bees do a dance to
for
convey
sure.
information. Do you think water dances, and that's
Yes,
how partly how, and it's basically dancing and singing, and we've got mechanisms to, because you mentioned ages ago that the cerebral spinal fluid rhythm, how it flows, matters a lot, not just what's in it. So
exactly.
this idea of water dancing at in different ways, maybe that's part of all this as well.
Exactly. So just to ask you, right? So we not like this is going to come out. It might take 30, 40 years, but do we need to wait that long? And that's kind of what I'm saying. So ask yourselves, right? Okay, what am I doing just from a purely, like, you're coming in to see me as a physician and sort of like, oh, are you sleeping well? No, you're not. Okay, what are you doing, something that helps rest or calm your system to help balance your parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous systems? Okay, if you're not sleeping well, and you're not doing some exercise like a deep meditation or some sort of thing that actually relaxes your sympathetic nervous system, I'm probably going to try to work on getting you to sleep better. All right. That's going to be all right. So just from that, right. And in sleeping better, now we're getting your fluid to move, because when you sleep, the cavities open up, the fluid can go through your brain, right? So just looking purely at that, now it's sort of like saying, like, oh, ask yourself, right? How can I get my river to flow? Even if you believe nothing of this. Well, we want the river to flow because we want to clean out the toxins. So now that's kind of becoming mainstream now. Okay, well, how do we do that? Okay, well, we sleep. Good. What else can we do? Well, people are looking at all these new gadgets, right? Virtual reality and induced ultrasound and stuff like that. Fine. But what else can we do? Right? And just like what you said, ask yourself, right? How is my river flowing and how is my water dancing within the river? And what are you doing consciously to help that flow and help create a water that is dancing? Now, we all probably have some sort of intuitive knowing of, I could do this, I could do that. Oh, interesting. Why don't I try that? Okay. And this is where we become our N of one, right? Is we become our own scientists. We start opening up to the interoceptive ability of perceiving our internal self. And we say, okay, let's start working on getting my fluid to flow and getting the water to dance. Well, how would I do that? Okay, well, let me put on this type of music. And then I ask myself the question, right? Well, how is that? And even just learning how to connect with your cerebrospinal fluid, which isn't very difficult, but people don't do it. Number one, because they don't know they have it. Number two, because they think it's weird to have a relationship with your fluid or anything like that. But just sort of saying hello, first of all, bringing awareness to your fluid, but then also just saying hello to it. That's the first way, right? Just saying, hey, how you doing? Starting to then develop a sort of an introspective ability, and then you can actually, you know, expose yourself to different types of music and say, and then go into that introspective and say, oh, you know, that just doesn't do the dancing for me. Oh, wow, something about this resonance or beat is doing it. Something's happening. Okay, cool. Now, right, add whatever is authentic to you. Do you dance? Do you move? Do you you know, do you do yoga? Do you do Pilates? Do you just like listening? Do you just like listening to you know, putting on some headphones and listening to the beats? Do you like to hum? Do you like to sing? Integrating any of those. Do you like to beat a drum? Right? Do you use tuning forks, crystal bowls, crystals? Does the light come in? Can you shift the frequency of the light by putting crystals on different parts? All those are questions that should, you know, that we should be spending way more research trying to figure out. But if we develop that internal interoceptive quality, we're all an N of one, and I bet you we could kind of like figure it out, and people are already doing so.
So do you think
Um,
the CSF is, you know, some people say we've got a higher self, because I was just about to ask you about the source next. So do you think the CSF is, some psychologists call it parts therapy, other people say superconscious, and because you mentioned the CSF being there when we were conceived, do you think it is part of a way of describing our more intelligent higher self?
I think it's a connection. It's a bridge
Okay, a
for
bridge
sure.
into the source, because I think
Yes.
maybe we can move into, you know, how do chakras work. Some people can channel or a medium. Some people are interested in um, doing ceremonies. So how does the CSF all move into all of this now? So it's all, you know, like, I think what's important, the N=1 is whatever floats your boat and works for you.
Yeah, so it's again going back to this sort of information or energy transfer, and that we live in these you know, we live in these physical bodies. We're in these physical body suits, biosuits, as my father-in-law calls them. And so let's just say if there is a universal source of energy, that I think most people would probably say there's something beyond the physical body that exists, and there's some energetic quality that's beyond the physical body. I think most people would probably agree with that. Is there some sort of universal energy source? Um, and that's again a personal inquiry that I would have, whether or not people call it God, cosmic consciousness, you know, source, whatever it might be. But you know, it's kind of like how does like an energy plant works? Well, an energy plant takes sort of, you know, super high watt energy and converts it into something that I can put my light bulb in my home, that can function. If I went to the energy plant and put a light bulb in, the light bulb would pop. It would explode. And so there's a you know, a step down process. There's sort of a let's say a differentiation process, so that I can put the light bulb in my home and it shines, right? So sometimes sort of directly tapping it, sort of like plugging in, might be too much, and we've seen maybe people who have had this experience where they might actually have like something like a psychotic break or something like that from directly sort of, you know, going straight to it, as opposed to having some sort of ability to work with the energy, to have a
That
relationship
could
with
be
the energy.
somebody in their 20s doing an ayahuasca ceremony without the basis in spirituality and meditation, or somebody doing Kundalini meditation by themselves when they're not ready. Because,
Exactly.
yeah.
Exactly. Where it's sort of like, oh my God,
Yeah.
then the narrative then becomes that was the most horrible experience. It was this, and it's like, wow, that was in my opinion something that was it was sort of that's the light bulb being plugged in at the power plant and it just explodes. And so
Mhm.
now there's no containment, there's no holding, there's no body, there's no embodiment of it. And so in essence, looking at it as like a step down differentiation process. Many people have described, even in doing, in any sort of ecstatic exercise where we're altering our state of consciousness. That can be through breath, it can be through body work, it can be through dance, it can be through music, it can be through drumming, it can be through psychedelics, it could be through any, I'm obviously leaving out a ton of different, but there's a sense that the physical space, the physical boundaries of our body um, morph. They are not as finite. Okay. And just being able to have a relationship with that, then some people may freak out, right? Oh my God, well, but that just that quality of sort of being able to have that relationship of, oh wow, where do I notice now my body beginning and ending? And is it here? And even though I'm touching my skin, even though I'm actually making contact, it feels like I can actually feel myself further away. Wow, that's fascinating. Right? As opposed to getting freaked out, a lot of people either get freaked out and sort of close that down. It's like, oh my God, and start to then hyperventilate and go into a sympathetic overcharge. Learning how to sort of navigate those things is really important. And so, from a cerebrospinal fluid perspective, from my perspective, and everybody that I've talked to that has had this ability to sort of resonate with the cerebrospinal fluid, that has had a relationship with it, sort of mention, calls it sort of like a bridge. Like you go into the fluid, and from the fluid as a whole, right? You could go into the water molecule if you want. You can go into just being in the fluid, but that the fluid, if there's this sort of step down process, and this is sort of a personal inquiry again in N of one. If there's this step down process, can we go from the fluid? So now it's sort of like all the attention, awareness is all in the fluid, and then just say, okay, from here, what do I connect to? What can I connect to? What's informing the fluid that is beyond me? That is beyond this physical, what I call myself, the physical body. Is there something that's informing the fluid? And what some people may notice is that I don't want to call it a portal or a channel or anything like that, but there's a bridge. There's a bridge to something more, something greater than the physical body, even something greater than the ethereal body, even even something greater than the individual body. And it's sort of like I guess so. It's going through the fluid and connecting. And various people sort of may have different levels at which they connect, but you kind of going all the way to what I call source, and even beyond, sort of like, but you're still fully embodied, right? So what happens in a lot of these practices is that you disassociate, or but that's not the actual. To me, it's this full embodiment with this two-way highway that's constantly informing and differentiating and de-differentiating and differentiating, de-differentiating, differentiating and de-differentiating. So there's a manifestation and unmanifestation that's occurring simultaneously. And that's the bridge then. That's this connection with the bridge for me through the fluid. And that's kind of where that, that then opens it. And then through this bridge now, well, then we're connected, and not at the individual level, but at the whole. And in essence, then that becomes the ocean, right? And here I am as a wave that emanates out of the ocean, and you're the wave that emanates out of the ocean. But when we go back to the ocean, you're not going to say, "Hey, that was a really cool wave you just were 5 minutes." No, you're going to be like, "Hey, we're water molecules hanging out in the ocean. There's no difference." It's not like the ocean that makes the wave is different than the ocean that is part of the ocean. Even though we see it as a manifestation, it's not. And so when it goes back, right, when a wave crashes, does the wave say, "Oh, I'm so sad I'm not a wave"? No. What does the water molecule say in that situation? It's like, I never changed. There was no change in me, no difference. And so that then helps us then have a relationship with this unmanifest pure potentiality, sort of the total potentiality, going back to the stem cells, and then starting to have a relationship with death and dying of the death of the physical body, the death of the waveform that emanates. And so sort of it's not just a one-way connection. It's a two-way connection. It's a bridge. We can use that as a bridge. But before you do any of that, it's not tapping. It's not putting the light bulb in at the power station. It's learning how to navigate the various thoughts, emotions, and sensations that are going to arise from this practice. And being okay with these sensations, emotions, and thoughts that do arise from it.
So in terms of what's possible with this practice, because now we're sort of going into, say, Joe Dispenza territory, and he's got lots of information on self-healing. And in a podcast with Rick Rubin asked him, could humans learn how to levitate? And then in a podcast with Jack Kruse, I asked him, is it possible to time travel if you've got temporal lobe epilepsy? And again, the answers were yes. So in your personal view, I'm asking now, what supernatural or paranormal ability, and also obviously Rupert Sheldrake and the telepathy, what do you think on that level is possible from deep practices or humans tapping into another power?
You're entering the realm of total potentiality.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just a matter of us learning how to navigate it. And that to me is kind of the essence of life.
So do you think it's back to what you said about the homeopathy, that it's a possibility within the quantum field, and even though it doesn't occur every time? Because the reason I ask all of these things is because I know that they're possible, and that's part what I'm learning. But then I think when you said about the homeopathy being a possibility in the quantum field, if you don't believe in something and inject doubt, then of course it's not going to work. So maybe what else more you've maybe elaborate on some mystical experiences you've had, or some of the, because I know you collect stories about NEDs and cerebral spinal fluid on your website. So maybe some examples of some stuff that you can't explain, or stuff that's really fascinated you, or stuff that's happened to you that you think, wow, okay, maybe I'm a magician after all.
Honestly, there's a few things because so the magic for me is being and living from a state of love.
I've heard that one for certain every time, that do everything from a state of love.
Yeah. And so there's no like what we would call, superpowers or anything like that. It's not there's no more like there's no more like miracles or anything like that. It's purely being love. And that is, in my experience, that trumps all. So in that love, oneness emerges, differentiation disappears, and anything is possible. Now, what's going to come? I have no idea. Could I intend that and manifest it? I could try. I could have a relationship with that and try. Do I care about the outcome? Not necessarily, because you're love. And so, I feel like people's kind of say like, oh, well, that was a spiritual teacher and they died because of this, or they weren't able to heal that or that in my opinion is all BS. Because it's sort of like, oh, things are going to happen. Like you might get hit by a car, but is that were you living in love? Because if you're living in love, then to me it doesn't really, it's not about healing this cancer or something like that. What's his name, Ronald Griffiths has stage 4 colon cancer, and he's published a lot of things about it. He's talked about his experience in other things, and a very healthy person, had a very strong spiritual practice, and yet thinks it's one of the greatest things that's happened to him. Right. So to me, the superpower is actually truly being love and living in this biosuit with love for yourself, for others. And from that, magic will appear. Magic will just, it's not magic. That's love in action. Like it just is. So, I could go down stories and stories and stories and stories. And again, all those stories to me are just, honestly, they're just experiences that are emerging from this total potentiality of love. And so again, if we latch on to that experience, then we're still in this, that's still something that's differentiated from that. And it's like, oh, I'm still trying to like live in this experience, as opposed to like, oh, we're actually in the total potential. And that to me is love. And so anything can emerge from that. And as it emerges, that's it. It emerges. Now you can talk about manifestation or not manifestation, and that then becomes from that plane of potentiality, from that pure plane of potentiality, from the totipotent cell, right? Can we, with consciousness, with our intention, with love, with an intention of love, start to now affect sort of physical matter, right? And I believe the answer to that is yes. Does it happen every single time? In my opinion, in my experience, no. And I'm still working on it, right? I'm still working on how to actually work with that. And that's, to me, the joy of life. Like it's the journey, right? It's the process that I'm going through to learn about this stuff. This is awesome. This is great. And we do it with an open curiosity. We do it with a playfulness. If it doesn't work, do I beat myself down? Oh, I'm such an idiot. No. We laugh, we joke, we sort of like, oh, that was cool. Maybe I wasn't, maybe I had, maybe the apple I ate wasn't right, or I had some gummy bears the night before, whatever it was. Who knows? Right. But I feel like as human beings, if we continue to kind of go down this path of introspection, of self-inquiry, um, of de-identifying with these, even these little experiences that may, and just say, oh, who am I? Wh- what am I? Who am I? And going back to sort of that pure potentiality and resting in that, then when we're in that, everything is possible. How it actually manifests, that's kind of the fun thing to, in my opinion, to investigate, to do so kindly for yourself with love, and not get so bent out of shape if it's like doesn't work. Who knows what linear time frame we're on, um, in terms of manifesting physical things. So that's kind of my 2 cents on that.
That's fascinating. Before we finish, I had one more concept to bring up, and you can not answer if you want, because you mentioned several times death. So, what do you think about past lives? Because I can't remember the name of the man who says he can remember all his past lives. It's very bad of me. And then again, just to bring up Rupert Sheldrake, he would say it's memories in the morphic field, and other people actually think they've lived another life. And because you've mentioned already how the CSF can connect through multiple generations. What are your views on, is this the only life we have, or do we just travel through, like, are we a spiritual thing having a human experience, and we just have a different human experience every time we reincarnate or come back?
Yeah, so I definitely believe in past lives. I think that there's enough anecdotal research out there, with very clear uh, data of memories, that very young people have had, of past life experiences, even coming back, and going back to the same spot, or a different spot, and telling somebody about the history that happened in that spot. Sort of people being like, wow, there's no way that that person would know that at that age. I think that there's enough research to sort of say, you know I have no doubt that there is that quality. Now, is it? Are we all? I don't know. Like, you know, is there some sort of like recycling mechanism that occurs? Like, could I be half me, half you next lifetime? Um, you know, to me, I sort of get this sense of, um, we all go back to the same pool, and however that pool then differentiates, that's up to the mixing of the pool. And so I also think that it's based on, again, the openness of the individual in coming back to, to even being open to the information that's being sent. If you're not open to it, you're probably not going to get that, or it's going to be much harder to listen to. And so therefore, maybe you do get a subtle information drop, and you don't pay attention to it. If you don't pay attention to it, you're not going to give energy to it. And so therefore, something may have come in and you just disregard it. Um, you know, my, I'm going to write it. I'm probably going to write a kid's book on this one day. But if you think of yourself, like, let's say I pass away, and I cremate myself, right? Or somebody cremates me. And then they take the ashes, and they pour the ashes in the ocean. And my wife and I have we have our will done, and we want our ashes poured, um, in the same place. And you're pouring the ashes in the ocean. Then what happens when you drop anything in the ocean that looks, or smells like food, is a fish will come up and eat it. And the ash is really carbon molecules, right? They're probably all the ash is carbon molecules. And the fish comes up and takes a bite, and even though it's like, this doesn't taste so good, um, but some of it gets in, and now it makes and now that carbon molecule gets absorbed into the fish's gut, and the fish is growing, and so that carbon molecule now is being used as the muscle of the fish, right? And then the fishermen are out and they catch that fish and they bring it back to shore and they sell it to the fish market, who then makes sashimi out of it, right? So where was that carbon molecule prior to being in the fish? That was in me. Where was it prior to me? I don't know, right? But this is a shared pool, right? So now it's in the fish. Now somebody else is actually eating that muscle, that fish tissue, and now they're absorbing the carbon molecule. And now what was me now is them. Now they make a new liver out of their carbon molecule that they just got from the eating the fish, right? Does the carbon molecule that was in me for 80, 90, 100 years, hopefully, right? Whatever it might be. Does that have a certain resonance that now they eat it and then all of a sudden they eat that carbon molecule and that has a certain resonance that then informs them? And so we are truly, from a elemental anatomic perspective, just all one, and it's this recycling. And
That,
there's some memories or some energetic information that is held that gets transferred, right? That to me is sort of more of like a plausible, hey, I might be if you sprinkle me in a garden and there's lettuce growing in that garden, guess what? I'm going to become part of that lettuce. The soil doesn't recognize the carbon. It's going to become, the carbon's going to go down. As you water it, that ash is just going to become the soil. It's going to pull the carbon up if it needs it. And now it's a leaf of the lettuce. It doesn't matter what so from an elemental perspective.
that's a bit like the three body problem book, the aliens that they opened up the hydrogen atom and it had a whole universe inside it, and that was enough to, I won't spoil the plot for people, but what you're saying is that, yes, I've heard of people getting an organ from an organ transplant and getting characteristics of that person, but you're saying
Exactly.
it's possible not just from a heart, but a carbon or a hydrogen, because of what I was saying, that maybe it's a little universe and there's so many other particles that we haven't discovered yet, that just one atom is enough to convey this information and we just don't understand atoms yet.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And we know that that is, right, because that in terms of like that would be the creation of the universe, for instance. And so um and that's why they make the telescope, to the Webb telescope, to be able to see, can we see the Big Bang? Can we see like where, what these stars were? And so that's where it comes, like, we are stardust.
Mm.
And physically, you know, physics, like astrophysically, that's absolutely true. And so that, to me, it's sort of like it's just kind of going back into this totally pure potential, undifferentiated void, let's say, but full. And then there's an emergence, and this is constantly happening, right? And so it will happen to all of us. We know that for a fact.
Yeah, that's fascinating. This has been such an amazing conversation. I know you've got the rest of the day to get on with. So I know that you've got offerings, as in you've got books, you do consultations, you've got more offerings. So maybe if you let people know what there is on offer so they can get in touch with you, find you, work with you, buy from you, whatever they want to do, and where to find you. I'll put the links in the show notes as well.
Okay, great. Thank you. Yeah, so holdingspace.com is where I'm trying to collect stories for anybody that does have a relationship with the cerebrospinal fluid, or has had any meditations in regard to the cerebrospinal fluid and sort of has felt this connection that we're talking about, sort of creating a repository, hopefully being able to publish some sort of anecdotal clinical stories. I'm doing a few interviews with people who have had like CSF leaks and stuff like that. And then I published four books on not on the cerebrospinal fluid yet, but they're kids books that are talking about awareness, and it's sort of like a progression. It goes from I am to all one to all love. So it's three books of sort of like it's kind of like a progression of realization, let's say. And then I published a book with my son called Close Your Eyes, What Do You See? And that's on imagination and manifestation.
And can people work with you directly or train with you or anything like that? I mean, this is like a maybe patients or clinicians or therapists that want to learn more about what you do and apply it, because I think you mentioned connecting with the CSF, and some people might want to be taught how to do that.
Yeah, so I don't have like a training ground yet, to be honest with you. Maybe you're stimulating something in this. I have been asked in the past. Mostly, what I've done is you people connect, reach out to me, and then I set up individual sort of phone calls or Zoom calls or something like that to do. It's not necessarily medical, so it's not under the it's not like I'm giving medical advice or diagnosing or treating anybody per se in that realm. It's mostly as like a um, like a coach per se.
Okay. Yes, I think that that's something that a lot of people will be interested in, the more sort of esoteric side, or people who've just learnt about CSF now and maybe want to learn, maybe they think they've had a leak or they've got a swelling or whatever. So I think it gives people an avenue to reach out. So it's been a real pleasure to talk to you today, like a Harvard doctor and scientist all in one. So I'm really grateful for your insights and information.
Great, thank you for having me.
Oh
Beautiful.
no, it was a really great conversation.
Thank you.